All right, it's very beautiful to see all of you in attendance for this extraordinary event. When we got the opportunity to put in dialogue two of the most important Black scholars of this generation about their field-defining text and these questions of state repression, Black radicalism, and where to go forward in the study of the Black radical tradition, which I think many of us have heard a lot about in the past few years, always with all caps. And I think as students, as scholars, we are struggling to try to think through creatively what methodologies, what interpretive frameworks, what philosophical questions and political judgments to pose to the inheritance that tradition and all its permutations provides for us. And so I couldn't think of a better panel to start the new year, especially with so many of us reeling from what's been going on campus and around the world. So what I will do is say a little bit about the institute that's putting this on before I introduce our moderator, my friend and former student, but you didn't really ever feel like a student. She was more prolific than me. So let me just say, this event is hosted by the Institute on Policing, Incarceration, and Public Safety, hosted here at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. I am a co-director with my dear friend, Elizabeth Hinton, the professor of law, African American Studies and History at Yale University. She sends her regrets. She desperately tried to be here, but just couldn't make it work. Speaking of police, incarceration, and public safety, they got to make their presence known. So the idea behind the Institute is to try to do a couple of things. One is that in a time of intensifying specialization, we have a lot of people who know a great deal about incarceration, a great deal about policing, or a great deal about crime, and often not a lot about the interpenetration of those three. We also have a lot of research in different disciplines that siloed, particularly in the social sciences, that purports to be about any of these main domains, but doesn't take seriously the approaches of historians or the normative questions that political theorists and philosophers would pose to the critical study of policing, incarceration, and public safety. So this institute has been organized to try to do some of that work here on campus, bring scholars together to support their research, bring students to support their research. We have a great data science team that's been doing some really innovative work on how to think about collecting data and making arguments around the size and scope and scale of the carceral state. And we've also been doing a lot of great community partnerships, including with organizations like Forward Justice. They're doing civil rights and anti-incarceration work in the South. So please be on the lookout for more events from us. We've got some cool things planned for the rest of the semester, including on collateral consequences of incarceration. And then next year, we've got a big conference planned on the 1994 crime bill and its consequences. So just a little bit to let you know about that. But now my real pleasure is to introduce my friend, someone I was honored to work with while she was a student here at Harvard University, Jackie Wang, who is, yes, that's how all y'all should have reacted. She is the American Democracy Fellow in the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History this year. And she is a honestly very prolific scholar, poet, multimedia artist, and currently assistant professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. She has path-breaking research on race, surveillance technology, and the political economy of prisons and policing. And she's working on a book that comes out of her wonderful dissertation called The Carceral Laboratory, The Rise of High-Tech Prisons and Police. And that's under contract with the good people at Princeton University Press. She's the author of Carceral Capitalism, one of the most exciting texts in carceral studies, one that students bring up to me all the time, and I brag that I know you. And she is also the author of the poetry collection, The Sunflower Cast, A Spell to Save Us from the Void, which was nominated, was a finalist, for the National Book Award. And she just released Alien Daughters Walk into the Sun, her new collection of poetry. So please give a round of applause to Professor Jackie Wang, and she will introduce our illustrious guests. Thanks.
All right, so first I'm gonna introduce Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly, who is an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University and a 2023-24 visiting scholar at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History here at Harvard. She is the author of Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States, the co-author of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, and the co-editor of Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writings, and of Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Post-Colonial State. Dr. Burden-Stelly has published in peer-reviewed journals, including Small Acts, Souls, Du Bois Review, Socialism and Democracy, International Journal of Africana Studies, and CLR James Journal. Her work appears in popular publications like Monthly Review, Boston Review, Essence, The Nation, Teen Vogue, Black Perspectives, and the Black Agenda Report. She is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace.
No compromise, no retreat.
Woo! So Dr. Orisanmi Burton is an assistant professor of anthropology at American University. His research employs ethnographic and archival methods to examine historical collisions between Black radical organizations and state repression in the United States. Dr. Burton's work has been published in North American Dialogue, The Black Scholar, Radical History Review, American Anthropologist, among other outlets, and has received support from the Wenner Gren Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, the Magritte Casey Foundation, which selected him as a 2021 Freedom Scholar. Dr. Burton's first book, entitled Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt, was published by the University of California Press on October 31st, 2023. So let's do a round of applause for these two experts. So just to get us started here, it's a huge honor to be in conversation with both of you. These are two of the most exciting books in the field that I've read in a long time. So I'm excited to get this opportunity to talk to both of you. And there are a number of resonances between your books. So I was talking with Ori before the event started about how Black Scare, Red Scare kind of lays the intellectual foundation for understanding state repression that Ori's book picks up on when we get to looking at the 70s. So just to start us off, I'm curious to hear about the arguments that you're making in your respective books. So Charisse, your book looks at the Black Scare and Red Scare in the US from the period of World War I through the early Cold War. Can you summarize the main arguments of the book, as well as how you are conceptualizing the Black Scare and Red Scare? And Ori, your book, Tip of the Spear, analyzes what you describe as the Long Attica Revolt, the pacification response to the revolt, and the new social formations, subjectivities, and technologies that emerge from the collision between revolt and pacification. Can you also describe the main arguments of your book? So I guess we can start with Charisse.
Yeah, I just want to preface this by saying I had a baby 6 weeks ago, so my brain is like mush. So please excuse any errant rubbish that I spew at this moment. Thank you. She's so cute. So what is the argument of my book? So essentially what I wanted to convey is maybe 3 or 4 points. The first is that you cannot understand anti-Black racial oppression without understanding anti-radicalism, specifically its enunciation through anti-communism after 1917. And likewise, you can't understand the repression of what I call radical Blackness without understanding how persons who organized, agitated, and engaged in activism for economic democracy against capitalist repression, whatever you want to call it, were niggerized, right? Were understood to be on the constitutive outsides of the state, not unlike Black people. And in fact, part of their delegitimizing was through a proximity to Blackness. So that's the first argument. The second argument is that we can't understand these forms of repression without having a sort of political economy understanding. And that is what I described through capitalist racism, which is a sort of spin-off of racial capitalism. There's reasons why I use capitalist racism, not racial capitalism. It's in the book. I won't pontificate about that right now. But you also have to understand imperialism. And so sometimes imperialism, like Pan-Africanism or some of these other terms, are treated as like passé, as if they don't matter, or as if the US is somehow not imperialist because it's not Great Britain or France or Portugal or something. And the other thing I wanted to argue about imperialism is that it starts at home, that imperialism is a domestic relationship as well as one that manifests abroad. And then those relationships are mutually constitutive. And so, in that the Black scare and the Red Scare are sort of the repressive technologies that come out of a particular form of capitalist exploitation rooted in racial hierarchy. The third argument, or the third sort of intervention, is I talk about the Black Scare, Red Scare, longue durée. And this, interestingly, is related to what Ori calls the long Attica Revolt. I think we're both sort of playing with temporality. Luckily, we're not historians, so we don't have to be beholden to 1861 to 1865, these like very narrow windows, and to understand anti-communism not just as this thing that was from sort of 1919 and 1920 and then leapfrog to the Cold War. We have to take this longue durée approach and see how there are ebbs and flows, but anti-communism, not least because of its relationship to anti-Blackness, is really ongoing. And finally, I think the fourth argument is that radical Blackness provides this particular specter of destabilization. And even those who are not communist or Bolshevik can be red-baited. So one of the examples I give is of Marcus Garvey, who was no friend of communism, especially after 1921. But because he believed in self-determination, he was anti-Euro-American imperialism. Because he believed in the organization of the working class, he could very easily be red-baited. And this is part of his sort of marginalization, deportation, and targeting by the U.S. government. And likewise, again, so I talk about Angelo Herndon. Angelo Herndon was a Black communist, and he was, anathema to the state, not only because he was a communist, but also because he was Black. And so there's a way this sort of interracialism and at least nominal belief in Black equality that is articulated by the Communist Party makes them a particular target of things like the Smith Act and the McCarran Act, et cetera. And so, to make a short story long, as one does, the book is to get us to think about capitalism, anti-Black racial oppression, anti-radicalism, and imperialism together, and that we have to understand all of these things in depth in order to really understand like where we came from, but also where we are, because we see many of these resonances happening today, which I mentioned in the epilogue. So,
peace, everybody. Peace. It's an honor to be here. So, tip of the spear, the primary argument is that the U.S. prison is a microcosm of the broader world, and that they're best understood not through the analytic of criminal justice, but rather through the analytic of war. And for some of you are nodding your head, so you've been exposed to the war analytic. For others, it will be sort of new and unique, but it's important to emphasize here that This isn't necessarily a new intervention. This is something that Black and other third world revolutionaries have been talking about for a really long time. But the reason that this analysis hasn't really reached the mainstream is because it's a particular population that's been targeted for neutralization, incarceration, criminalization, not just of their bodies and activities, but also of their ideas and knowledge. And so part of what I'm doing is looking at the prison as a kind of a carceral archive that seeks to contain ideas, prevent them from circulating, and to show how people inside of prisons create new theories, create new methods about liberation. Because again, they understood that the prison was not some hermetically sealed institution somewhere where criminal justice sort of protocols are developed to sort of rehabilitate people, but rather that it was a technique of social and political and economic domination and class rule and race warfare, in fact. And so the methods and techniques that they developed to try to free themselves in different kinds of proto-abolitionist, revolutionary, and third world formations are techniques that are extremely relevant to us today in terms of thinking about how we sort of manage and overcome the contradictions that arise from internally within movements, but also when movements collide with state repression. And so part of what the book is trying to do is to sort of decarcerate this criminalized tradition of knowledge. And I do this by revisiting the Attica prison rebellion of 1971, which I think is a story that many people think they know, but in fact, the primary narrative around Attica is a result of a kind of domestication of the rebellion, a de-radicalization, one that makes it appear as though it was first, it also geographically contains the rebellion, right? It truncates its internationalism, it truncates the duration, right? So we're used to hearing about Attica as this 4-day rebellion against perverse and abusive prison conditions, which of course it was, and prison conditions were part of what people were demanding for, but many within Attica saw themselves and were seen by the state as revolutionaries who were engaged in capacious and internationalist forms of struggle and had developed and were continuing to develop material connections with third world liberation movements, not just outside of prison walls, but outside of US boundaries. And that state actors who were later responsible for forging the carceral state understood this internationalism, and that part of the reason why prisons are the way they are today is because they're institutionalized forms of counter-revolutionary warfare. And the fact that we continue to analyze the prison through the lens of criminal justice, in fact, mystifies this other trajectory of war that's embedded in the carceral state. So I can say more about any of that.
Yes, we will get to that. This is like if you're ever doing an interview for a job, you keep it short and you say, and I'm happy to say more about that. But we will get back to the war analytic a bit later. I wanted to jump to the question of methods. Charisse, you just said, you know, we're not historians, so we can play with temporality. We can talk about the longue durée, and, you know, for Ori, you're thinking about like the long Attica Revolt, and Charisse, you're thinking of the Red Scare and the Black Scare and the longue durée. So, Charisse, you just said you're not a historian. I've heard you also say this to someone else who was identifying you as a historian. You say, I
Black
use
studies.
Yes,
Classically trained.
Exactly. And yet you use archival methods in your research. In addition to historicizing the Black Scare and the Red Scare, you also set out to theorize U.S. capitalist racist society, the structural location of Blackness, and anti-communist governance. So it seems like you're also, in addition to using historical methods, also attempting to theorize these concepts that you're working with. Ori, your appointment is in anthropology, yet you also use historical methods in your research, but you do this to subvert what you call counterinsurgent historiographies that are rooted exclusively in state sources as opposed to the rebel archive and revolutionary knowledge production. And one thing that I found really thrilling about your book is you take seriously non-academic revolutionary forms of knowledge production. It's on the same plane for you and your work. So I was wondering if both of you could talk a little bit about the methods that you use in your books and why you use these methods.
Go ahead. You go first.
So, the genesis of my project is in a Black radical demand for more rigorous research in sort of carceral studies, right? So it didn't come out of a sort of academic survey of the literature and a gap in the literature, but rather movement elders saying, look, we already did a lot of this work and we need someone like you to see if it's possible to sort of like demonstrate the rigor of our analysis using the tools of academia. So that's where the project grows from. And so as a scholar, I'm accountable. I have a different structure of accountability that's not really grounded in academia. But yes, I'm an anthropologist. I'm also trained as a library and information scientist, and I have a sort of a collector's impulse. So the thing about state sources, so I use state sources, right? But it's important to understand, and I think Dr. CBS's book really points this out, that the state doesn't really understand radicalism. Right, so sometimes there's a willful ignorance, right? Sometimes there's a refusal to see stuff, but also they just don't understand the demands and the sort of aspirations and the methods of various forms of Black radical politics. I think there's a part in your book where someone who's in the Lusk committee like resigns from the committee and basically says, you guys are not rigorous at all, you're not reading these things, right? So it's important, so we use state sources, but it's important not to take them too seriously, especially when those state sources are talking about Black radicalism, because part of what those sources have embedded in them is a racist epistemology, which isn't capable of really understanding the demands, right? So it's not a question of if, it's how you use state sources. I read them in a hostile manner. I read them in a disloyal manner. I read them in a disobedient manner. And also state sources are not my starting point. My starting point is a Black radical archive. I use state sources to see if I can corroborate what others have told me, whereas I think the dominant mode of historiography around Black radicalism is precisely the opposite way, that state sources are seen as the most valid, the most whatever, and then you might interview a person here or there or cite an archive to sprinkle a little bit of flavor on it, right? So I have the precise opposite way. And also amplifying criminalized sources and thinking really specifically about vocabulary, which is something else that Dr. CBS talks about, right? And so when they say extremism, when they say criminalization, when they say crime, when they say terrorism, when they say all of these witch words, to quote W.E.B. Du Bois again from Dr. CBS's book, we have to have the kind of nimbleness, the intellectual nimbleness to understand that various forms of resistance exist beneath, beyond, and behind this sort of criminalizing language. So an attentiveness to language. And the last thing I'll say is paying attention to different kinds of sources, right? So, I talk about music as a way of knowing in the book, because that's the way the brothers that I was interviewing talked about. I talked about letters as a form of knowledge, physical scars that are on the body as a form of archival knowledge. Because part of what we're dealing with, especially when we're thinking about war, that means that there's a conscious opponent who's trying to win the war, not only in the immediate sense, but also to win the historical war around what will be remembered and how these different conflicts will be remembered. And so I try to show how actors on both sides of the struggle are also engaged in a narrative war and to take that seriously as well.
Yeah, so there's just so much resonance. And so I think just to pick up on the state archive or the state sources question, part of what you have to do is demystify them. Because so much about the state apparatus, because they're actually constructing the enemy as they're targeting it, and they just say anything. They get so much stuff wrong, but it doesn't matter because they have the monopoly on violence and truth with a capital T, right? And so part of why we use these state sources is to demystify them. So I use like the Lusk Committee document, something called RACON, or the Racial Conditions Report, which was commissioned by J. Edgar Hoover during World War II to surveil Black radicalism and see its connection to sort of to foreign powers, basically, whether it be the Communist Party, the Communist International, or like the Japanese. There's some other like state sources, but again, you read those against I read those against like the We Charge Genocide petition. And also part of how I came to like the Lusk Committee, the Dias Committee, some of these other, some of these sort of state forms of knowledge is through reading Black radicals. And so likewise, it's lifting up these voices of people that most of us have never heard of or whose knowledge has been delegitimized, even though some of them worked in universities. Like Alpheus Hunton, for example, was at Howard University. Doxy Wilkerson was at Howard University. But because they're members of the Communist Party, and also because they're Black, they're seen to be subjective or to be dupes of Moscow, or simply their knowledge has been buried, which is interesting because there's so much scholarship now about like silences in the archive. Okay, but there are also really robust archives that are not silenced, but rather ignored, that are disregarded, that are collecting dust at the Tamiment or the Schomburg or wherever, because they're considered to not be important. And so people resort to like making up shit when really you can just, which is fine, whatever. But you also can really find this knowledge if you take these people seriously as theorists, as knowledge producers, as truth tellers. Something I love how Ori talks about like being disloyal to those sources, but also something that resonated between our books, I think, is that we have to kind of create some vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And again, some of it is just repurposed. Like there's very little that's brand new that we say. You know, that's really not the work of Black studies. We don't have, because we're not, the permutation of knowledge and the sort of copywriting of knowledge is a really neoliberal mindset. What we need to do is excavate and perhaps articulate to our contemporary moment, right? And so, but it's important, again, in this project of demystification, it's important to have language that's precise and have language that can illuminate that which has been obfuscated or that has been distorted or marginalized or what have you. So, you know, when I talk about, for example, the structural location of Blackness, part of how I define it is like Blackness is not, it's not race per se. It's not just race. It's not class. It's definitely not caste. I've written about that elsewhere. Whatever, you can see the movie. I don't care. But, and so how do we actually describe the sort of the ideological, the material, the interpersonal, and the political components that are constitutive of Blackness, but that also doesn't just reduce it to like abjection. So the last thing I'll say is that in terms of temporality, I talk about the Black scare, White scare, longue durée as a problem space, but history does matter. Again, your theory has to be rooted in something, right? There's a lot of theorizing off of theory or off of nothingness, like memoir imagination, again, which is fine, but
that's fine.
It has to be rooted in, like your work has to be rooted in something. And it can be like, so, or as an anthropologist, so it can be, what are the like participant observation or oral histories or interviews, but it has to be rooted in something. And so, and context does matter. This ontological turn that knowledge has taken, it's very, very problematic because context matters, geospatial difference matters, time matters, at the same time that we also want to eschew or push back against the disciplining, literally, of academia, whereby, again, if you silo knowledge in these discrete temporal categories or through these discrete disciplines, it's a technique of sort of class and elite reproduction. And so part of when I'm thinking about method and methodology, it's like, how do we tell a truer story from people whose analysis has been here that matters, but has been criminalized and disciplined, so that we continue to think that like class doesn't matter, that race is, only race hustling is the only way to understand race. Anyway, so that's methodology.
So good. Thank you for that. Okay, I wanted to come back to the question of war and the question of peace. So Ori, central to your book is the argument that prisons are war, an asymmetrical form of war that remains hidden from view. And as you previously mentioned, this framework has long been part of the Black revolutionary tradition, particularly in the Black Liberation Army, prisoner organizing, and the writings of George Jackson, who theorized urban guerrilla warfare. So he was thinking specifically about asymmetrical war. In what sense are prisons war? You already started talking about that, but if you wanted to get into it a little bit more, you can go there. Okay, Charisse, in the epilogue of your book, you also cite Dhoruba bin Wahad, who comes up in Ori's book, and the Black Liberation Army, particularly the claim that police violence is an undeclared war against Black people. You theorize the links between Wall Street imperialism and domestic anti-Blackness, while also historicizing Black resistance to US imperialism during World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Cold War. In chapter 6, you describe the criminalization of Black peace activists like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson in the 1950s, particularly their organizing around nuclear disarmament. Can you both talk about how your books understand war and peace?
Who's going first? I'll go. While reading your book, I was, this idea of Wall Street imperialism, really stuck out to me because, the sort of key architect of this carceral warfare project in New York was Nelson Rockefeller, who's heir to the Standard Oil dynasty, right? And whose brother, David Rockefeller, was the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, and who, was connected to the Rockefeller Foundation, and who had, Nelson had a massive intelligence gathering operation in Latin America, which he was constantly employing counterinsurgency techniques to defend oil interests in Latin America against sort of, revolutionaries in Latin America. And there's archival evidence that shows that Rockefeller draws a tactical, political, ideological connection between people who were rebelling in New York state prisons and sort of the Tupamaros in Uruguay and elsewhere throughout Latin America. And so the techniques that then get implemented in the New York prison system mirror the counterinsurgency techniques that are used against guerrillas in Latin America, in Vietnam, and elsewhere. So part of the answer to the question, how are prisons war, is a historical answer, which is to say, beginning in roughly 1967, administrators of war start to consciously insinuate counterinsurgency techniques developed in foreign theaters of war in the New York State prison system, and that orientation is what has been driving the growth of mass incarceration, and that a lot of that has been sort of mystified again by this criminal justice discourse. Some of the implications of thinking about this are, first and foremost, I think it dispenses with the persistent an extremely frustrating idea that the system is broken, right? If you're thinking about war, then it becomes very clear that, and George Jackson talks about, we're never going to win until we realize we're dealing with a determined enemy who's employing tactics and strategy. And this idea of system brokenness mystifies the idea that any kind of tactic that's employed by oppositional forces is going to meet opposition. So it dispenses with the idea of system brokenness and shows that prisons were never really about justice or crime control, but rather about neutralizing surplus populations and neutralizing the very possibility of radical and specifically Black radical organization. It centers conflict, it centers the question of violence, and it allows us to trace out these various, because the other thing is that prisons are a laboratory where these academics from elite universities descend upon the prison to conduct their nefarious experiments, all kinds of different experiments that are developed specifically for the purpose of then redeploying them on populations outside of prison walls. So again, the prison is never just about prison, and this is the point about them being a microcosm. In this way, prisons are in fact a method for analyzing how power operates in the broader world. And again, I was struck while reading your book about all the things you're writing about. And in fact, my book temporally picks up in some ways where yours leaves off. And many of the people that I'm writing about in the book are facing the sort of the infrastructure that was set in motion during the period that you're writing about. So for instance, a lot of the intellectual architecture for the prisoners' counterinsurgency was set in motion by the House Internal Security Committee, which is a rebranded name for the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is a major feature of your book. So I'll stop there. Well, actually, I'm going to stop in one other place. Because this is really important. It's central, in fact. There's different ways of theorizing war. And we need to understand that, the carceral warfare state is an expression of an imperialist war. Mm-hmm. The Black radicals who are responding to that are waging a counter war. And the narrative strategies that the state uses is to make it seem as though Black people who rebel are the ones who are instituting or launching a war, when in fact, they're responding to a war that was imposed upon them. And the ethics and morality of the war of resistance, the counter-war, are incommensurable to the ethics and morality of the imperialist war that people like, Rockefeller and others are waging. So I just want to make that clear.
Mm-hmm. So the importance of peace in my story has to do with the fact that the U.S. is a war-driven, racially hierarchical political economy. And war-driven is really important because if you think about the U.S. starts to rise to global hegemony, or it becomes an imperialist power proper like 1890. Well, 1776, war against indigenous nations, but 1890, right? The Spanish-American War. Then we have World War I, right? Then World War II, then the Korean War. Cold War is happening in this context. Then you got Vietnam, then you got Desert Storm. I think it's something like there's maybe 20 years or less that the U.S. is not at war. And then what happens with legislation like the Smith Act and I talk about a bevy of legislation in my book, but basically the wartime relationships that are established by the Espionage Act and the Subversion Act become codified in peacetime. Because peacetime is also war. It's either preparation for war, warmongering, or this low intensity warfare or domestic warfare. It's also important. This is why the internal colonialism thesis is also pretty important, right? Because it does many things, but part of what it also does is point out the imperial and war-driven relationship that is present domestically. And then also when I theorize Wall Street imperialism, I talk about the relationship between the U.S. North and the U.S. South as an imperial relationship. The Rockefellers figure prominently because so much of what's owned in the South is owned by banks and creditors in the North, to the point where farmers in the South refer to capital coming from the North as like foreign capital, right? And so that is important. The relationship between imperialism and war is important because war is a key technique and technology, as are sanctions. And part of what Black people experience historically and part of what radicals experience historically are sanctions in various ways and forms of expropriation. Now, if it is that the U.S. is a war-driven, racially hierarchical political economy, it means that peace then is antithetical to the state, right? Agitating for peace, especially peaceful coexistence, if we're thinking about Du Bois and Paul Robeson, peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, which is constructed as an existential threat to the United States, then peace becomes treasonous, peace becomes seditious, peace becomes a threat to U.S. existence, but really it's a threat to accumulation. And so this is how, again, war relates to the method or the form of capitalism in which the U.S. engages. The other important thing is that peace is not the absence of conflict. So in Black Alliance for Peace, this is how we define peace. But like peace is not the absence of conflict. It's not like kumbaya, like don't do anything. Peace, part of how peace is realized is through the collapse of the imperial colonial system and actual equality among nations and peoples. And this again proves very problematic for the United States that constructs itself as the world police, right? As the arbiter of freedom and democracy. And so if the US no longer, number one, if the US is no longer the world police, and number two, if peace is understood in these terms as sort of economic, political, and social equality, then the way that the US defines peace, which is actually through national security and through its own interests, then the US ceases to be this global hegemon. And so all of that to say, war, understanding that we are perpetually at war and that these sites of exploitation and oppression are forms of warfare. And on the other hand, understanding the ways that the Black radical tradition has always articulated forms of peace that have to do with total decolonization and the end of imperialism. And this is part of the reason why not this tradition, as well as these individuals and organizations are targeted, is really key to having a clear understanding, or that is to say clarity about what the United States actually is, and again, where we are currently.
Great, thank you for that. That just made me think of, the U.S.'s bombing of Yemen recently. What is it called? Operation Prosperity Guardian. It's kind of laying bare the ways in which warfare is actually a means of protecting commercial interests abroad. So I'm going to ask you one more question, then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So this last question is on reform as counterinsurgency. So both of your books describe how reform can function as a form of pacification that aims to demobilize insurgent struggles. So Charisse, you write, quote, "Racial liberalism, especially as espoused by the Black petite bourgeoisie and leadership class, was another form of societal self-regulation that was as much strategic as it was coerced. The intersection of racial liberalism and anti-communism was rooted in the idea that opposition to communism could facilitate Black advancement, that the Negro question could be resolved through reforms to U.S. political, economic, social, and moral institutions, and that socialism was not the best means of eradicating racial oppression," end quote. So Ori, you write that after the Attica massacre, there was a, quote, multifaceted campaign of prison pacification. The planners and administrators of this campaign strategically co-opt the demands of the prison movement and redeployed them in ways that strengthen their ability to dominate people on both sides of prison walls. Through shrewdly constructed discourses of reform, they created new and improved prisons, bolstered security protocols, augmented their labor force, and legitimize their power, all while appearing to bow to radical demands, end quote. And I think you also convinced me that reform itself is a kind of psyop. I was like, well, yes, there's something about the way that it's meant to, win the minds of the public through claiming to bow to radical demands. Can both of you discuss how reform is weaponized against Black liberation struggles in the respective contexts you read about?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing about reform is difficult, right? Because reform is one means by which oppressed people have to slow their rate of oppression.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So it is, but that means that reform is ultimately negotiating the terms of your immiseration. So it's a real conundrum. But it's essential, right? So in reading Ori's books, the reforms did stop some of the most brute forms of repression. But here, the problem is that we only care about the most brutish, violent forms of anything. We see that with what's happening today in Palestine, right? So for example, people are just starting to call what's happening a genocide. What is actually true is that it's a war intensified genocide. The genocide has been happening for a very, very long time, but because it's only when things reach a crescendo that we care about them, that reform, this is why reform is able to obfuscate, right? We see it with Trump versus Biden, right? Trump is like the worst. I also write about this with respect to like Truman versus like the Dixiecrats. But anyways, so I think Black Cold War liberalism, and we see it today. We see the Black petty bourgeois liberalism as a form of pacification, and it goes by different terms. Some might argue, I'm not saying this, Harvard, don't fire me, that DEI is a form of pacification, right? Some might argue that having a few chips in the cookie, if you will, is a form of pacification. With respect to like Cold War liberalism, part of that strategy was that if it is that the Black scare and Red scare are mutually constitutive, if it is that we can direct the Black scare from the Red scare and just harness the Red scare. So basically, if it is that we attack the communists as well, then we can separate out the Black scare. We can shame the Black scare, that is to say like anti-Black racial oppression, by using some of the same talking points with respect to communists or socialists. Not least, one of the most popular ones with respect to decolonization is like, if you don't support decolonization in the global South, then those people are going to be wooed by the communists. With respect to the United States, it's like, if the United States doesn't roll back Jim Crow, then you're going to give the Soviet Union and the communist talking points to shame the United States and to undermine its claim to be the arbiter of democracy and equality. And so, and I will say, some African Americans, and I use that, so African Americans as an ethnicity, take that American very seriously. It's the but-for logic. They believe that the United States is actually the greatest country in the world, but for racism. People actually believe this, and that racism is a stain on the otherwise lofty goals of the state. Okay, and so part of what Cold War liberalism does is it harnesses that. It points to literally how the U.S. narrates itself, right? And so reforms come out of that. Reforms are simply, this is how the U.S. self-fashions. And therefore, in order to really live up to those ideals, particular tweaks can be made to the system. But as we know, if it is that the system itself is built upon oppression and repression, then no amount of reform is going to actually ameliorate the conditions for the majority. And so reform, it is important to the state to reproduce the status quo or reproduce whatever the next regime of repression and exploitation is going to be. At the same time that sometimes oppressed people just want to win, right? Mm-hmm. And so pending revolution, right, these reforms become wins, and they can be forms of consciousness raising. They can sort of show people that you can mobilize and win a campaign. And so that's what allows you to keep going. But what tends to happen is that the means become the end.
That's right.
And then the goalpost moves. So that is sort of how I engage the reformism. The other way I talk about it is that for white workers, I talk about the Red Scare as the stick and the Black Scare as the carrot, because what the Black Scare does for white workers is allow them to at least think that they're better off than like those Blacks, right? It allows them to have particular so real benefits, not all that many economic benefits, because they're still poor. And the ruling class still hoards the majority of the resources, but comparatively, the Red Scare, or the Black Scare can be harnessed for particular types of benefits, right? So for particular types of nominal gains, whereas the Red Scare is a form of like brute disciplining. It's meant to lop off the most radical and most effective organizers who really can help to implement like material change. So to make the short story long again, reformism is in some ways, and I think this is evident in Ori's book, in some ways more dangerous than the brute forms of repression, because as we're seeing today, the brute forms of repression has their limits, whereas reformism can be couched as being on the side of good. And so that's something that we really, and then and reformism is also supported by people who claim they're on your side. So, yeah.
Yeah, yes to all that. Trying to think of where to start. You know, so I'm talking about war in the book, but I'm really talking about a specific moment of war, like of counterinsurgency warfare, which comes into being to crush anti-colonial movements. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about imperialist war, I mean, it goes all the way back to, you know, the Romans. And you know, the political function of reform, you could really distill it down to divide and conquer. I'll also talk a little bit more about like how that plays out, right? But even with the Romans, like etymologically, the word peace can be traced through the Pax Romana, and in that context, peace meant pacification. Mm-hmm. So it's actually what Dr. King called a negative peace, right? For them, it is the absence of conflict in the absence of justice also, right? As opposed to a positive peace, which is the absence of conflict in the presence of justice. But so under counterinsurgency, the political function of reform is exactly what you just said. It's a way because counterinsurgency is population warfare. And so they're trying to break the population up into different categories. They understand that there's going to be, this is their framing. I'm not saying that I necessarily accept it, but this is the terms under which the prisoners' counterinsurgency functions. They understand that there's going to be a population of resistors who cannot be bargained with. And what they want to do is to isolate that population. And the way that they isolate that population is to seize upon some of the more palatable demands that are coming from the movement and to grant those demands in ways that allow those in power to maintain their power. So these will be what we would call concessions or institutional reconfigurations. And the purpose of these institutional reconfigurations is to force people in the movement to engage with the state on its own terms, and to start resisting through the frameworks that the state has established for them, which are already co-opted. And then it becomes a different terrain of struggle. Now, that doesn't mean that that terrain of struggle is worthless or that it should be abandoned. And so part of what needs to be nurtured is a historical consciousness of the intent behind the reform and the history of how that reform was implemented. Because exactly what Dr. CBS said is what happens. The reform then becomes the actual goal of the movement. The movement gets subsumed around defending this reform, which was instituted in the first place as a counter-revolutionary method. And I think DEI is a precise example of this, right? That people on the left are put in positions where they have to defend DEI, which is not even a radical or revolutionary demand at all.
And its lackeys.
Right, and its lackeys. So thinking about and so this is the importance of historical consciousness becomes really key. So part of what reform does then is it creates cleavages in the movement, right? Where people who can be sort of bribed or bought off are channeled into sort of institutional politics, right? And what does that do? It renders the people who are understood to be revolutionaries more isolated and more vulnerable for neutralization. And neutralization is, of course, a euphemism for convert, capture, or kill. And so I'm talking about, there's layers of incarceration, right? So revolutionaries would say that the outside world is just minimum security prison, the prison is maximum security prison, and then there's a prison within that, right? Which is these different forms of solitary confinement, behavior modification, isolation, and all of those things. And again, the idea behind that is to develop strategies that can then be re-implemented and redeployed in a generalized way against us. And so part of what the war analytic does and the reform analytic does, it also problematizes this idea of collateral consequences. Because the theory says that like the function, the primary goal of the prison is to discipline us. That it's actually not about the people on the inside of the wall, it's about sending a message to people on the outside of the wall. So what some might call collateral consequences in the sort of parlance of criminal justice is in fact the prison is war operating in the way that it is designed to operate.
Great, thank you so much. We have time to take a few questions, so let's open it up to the audience now.
Remember, sorry, I always have to say this. This is Q&A, not U&A.
Yes.
So please make your questions as marvelous as you want them, but concise. There you go.
And an actual question.
I'm about to quote you on that.
Also, now nobody wants to talk. I had an exegesis.
Thank you. Thank you both for really phenomenal words. This is wonderful to hear. I have a question that maybe feeds off of just what you were just talking about with reform. Something that I've noticed in thinking about war and thinking about various institutions at war, whether it's in prisons or in other institutions or in countries that are opposing imperialism, like Cuba or Guinea-Bissau or any of these countries. There's this kind of focusing on war allows you to look at like attacking imperialism, but then there's also the question of like the people in those institutions or in those countries. And I feel like there's always like a contradiction or there's a challenge between like Cuba is facing US imperialism head on, and that's like a good thing, but also like the people of Cuba are suffering heavily. And similarly in the prison and like with the prison movement in the book, you talk about like, it's like this long Attica revolt. There's a lot of revolutionaries, but then there's a lot of people that are just like suffering in that institution. So I'm curious whether, and in movement as well, right? So I'm curious if you have any insights about like things that are used or tactics used that don't fall into the counterinsurgency piece, or things that you've come across that kind of account for like how you hold on to like the humans within these institutions that are opposing imperialism, and how to not have those things be to not have that humanness be exploited to destroy the sort of weapon of counter war, to destroy the movement.
I think that question is irresolvable, or we would have won. I think that's why the struggle is ongoing. So like, one answer always is like join an organization, right? The more always be rooted in a collective. The more collective your struggle, the more difficult it is to like be co-opted and to bow to reform. But even then, so I write about like the Council on African Affairs, and a man who founded that named Max Yergin became a cold warrior eventually. He got beat up by Paul Robeson and Althea Sunton and some other people, but it's just funny. But so it's really, really difficult because again, part of the reason for being a revolutionary is because things are bad, things are hard, you're suffering, you don't have the bare necessities, right? And so it's hard to keep on fighting, especially if you're losing like a battle after battle after battle, to not just bend, to not want something, right? And then there's this idea that, you can join the thing and change it from within, which is crazy. But I think that we just have to come to terms with like, revolutions are bloody, people die, people suffer. I think that part of what we can do, and part of like why I think Black nationalists, for example, take this like a vow of poverty, is like, so you share or democratize what you do have to try to mitigate. So it's not just a certain group or a certain ascriptive category that is always the ones who suffer, right? That you're at least democratizing, you're at least democratizing that suffering, or on the other hand, those resources. So I don't, and you keep going, right? So part of what the people that I write about in my book, one organization got shut down by the Subversive Activities Control Board. They formed a new one. They hired as many of their comrades as they could because these people were blacklisted. They create international connections and relationships to try to sort of shore up not just like material resources, but like your will, like, your ethical commitment. So I don't really have an answer to that question, because again, I do think that if we can figure that thing out, then we would be able to like withstand these constant waves of like onslaught.
I mean, I like the question. It's interesting that you tried to ask for an answer that falls outside of counterinsurgency, because precisely the question you're asking this is the way that counterinsurgent administrators think. In other words, I mean, and this is also how sanctions work, right? How do we manipulate the conditions such that, to try to foment an internal revolution, the overthrow of the forces that we don't want, right? Or in the case of the prisons, they were like, okay, prisons are really brutal, so maybe we should improve conditions to get them to stop rebelling, right? I mean, and so this is this is the kind of contradiction that Dr. CBS was talking about. I think for me, what this question gets to is what I was talking about earlier, about how these different forms of war are incommensurable. Because in my analysis of Attica, when the Attica brothers took over, they had a conversation about, okay, are we just gonna kill all of our hostages? Or are we gonna do something else? And they had a debate, and they decided not to do that. And what did they do instead? They built a commune where they figured out how to redistribute resources and meet their own needs. And like, they took long walks under the stars and talked about other shit. Like, it wasn't about like, okay, let's figure out how to, exact as much brutality as possible in terms of retaliation. It was like, let's figure out how to live the way that we actually want to live. So I think being attentive to those moments is really important. And also, honoring the fact that, like, I mean, I think if you would talk to the average, even in the US, the average Black person in the US, and say, oh yeah, well, what do you think about like, oh, politics is war? And like, let's think about history. Do you accept that premise? They'd be like, yeah, but they still have to get up and go to work. So it's like, it's not like, their consciousness isn't necessarily gonna be attuned to that level of struggle every day because of all of the other things that we have in our lives to try to kind of keep up with. So I mean, I think these are some of the contradictions.
Hi, my name is Jair. So I guess this is a question for Dr. Ori. You use the war analytic and thinking about war now, right, with the war of extermination on Gaza. Do you see like the war on Black America, the carceral state, and things like the war of extermination on Gaza as like a continuum with different levels of intensification to kind of like, how do you deal with a insurgent, like a nation seeking liberation?
So I could answer that in one word and just say yes. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, yes. The answer is yes. I mean, I think it's obvious. One thing I'm doing a little bit more, so the end of my book talks about some like MK Ultra stuff and behavior modification stuff that I didn't plan on getting into it, but it just like, the evidence kept pushing me in that direction. So I ended up right. So one of the folks that shows up that I didn't write about in the book, what's the dude's name? Zvi Herman. I'm still trying to figure this guy out, but he was part of these experiments on prisoners in New York. And he was also, before that, he was the head of science and technology in the Israeli prison system. And then he got a fellowship to work at McGill University, which if anyone knows anything about MK Ultra is like one of the key sites of MK Ultra, right? So there are also these material connections, right? But I think, part of what these sort of like counterinsurgency theorists do, and I don't take them too seriously as theorists, because part of what they do is they just plagiarize each other's work. And so there's always some new manual about some new style of war that's coming out, that's being deployed. But so many of the tactics that are being employed in Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere, it's counterinsurgency, and it's not as though these tactics have been necessarily prototyped here and exported abroad, but that is this ongoing conversation and circulation between these sort of counterinsurgency actors who are empowered by the state to traverse different levels of state formation, to traverse boundaries, and to carry out different experiments in repression and suppression. And so, we're seeing it play out live right now. Yeah, thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Charity. I have an epistemology question because I mostly just appreciate great writing, right? The information is great, but I wanted to ask how you all kind of parse out the genealogy of knowledge that you all are weaving together between things, like you said, not validating Eurocentric or state sources, but giving the readers a whole new direction if they want to follow. Like, how does that process in terms of writing to figure out, I want to connect, the voice of this person and this experience to somebody like Catherine McKittrick, or like, how are you all figuring the genealogies or the mapping to help us as readers say there's a whole nother set of archives and texts that we can go into? Because I appreciate that so much in the writing of both of you.
That's a good question. I think some of it is a little bit arbitrary. Like, I cite my friends because my friends are all smart and do the work that I care about. Seriously, and Gerald Horne, I always cite Gerald Horne, and I look at his footnotes. See, Gerald Horne is my roadmap. Wherever he goes, I go. And then it's important, I think, that too often we think about like theorists or writers as like singular figures, but they're all part of collectives, right? They're all part of, the people I write about are part of organizations. And so they're talking about other people. They're in conversation with other people. And it's also like if you use correspondence, right? So part of the theory I get is from correspondence, or it's from like party meeting notes, right? Or party minutes. And so I think, but I think reading footnotes in secondary literature is really important because you see who those people are talking to. And so, Ori does actual interviews and talking to people. I have a different conversation with, they're like ancestors now, but I have a different type of conversation with them. And I feel like Alpheus Hunton and Doxy Wilkerson, Shirley Graham Du Bois, all these people and they sort of, and then whoever they cite. So for example, like Esther Cooper Jackson, she wrote this thesis. So I just kind of looked at like, who are the people she's talking about and then who are in her footnotes, right? And then there's people who like reviewed her thesis. And so it's sort of like that. I'm not abreast of a lot of the new stuff. I'm not a huge fan. I really liked Ori's books, and I think you all should read it. Like, I really enjoyed. It's the first book I've read like cover to cover in quite some time, because some of them is like, okay. So I think, and I think that's a lesson, right? The new stuff is whatever. My book is new stuff, right? But I think reading the older stuff is really important, because a lot of the new stuff is just beautifully worded bullshit, or is just rehashing what somebody said a long time ago and not citing them, right? Or burying that citation. So I think reading the stuff from like the 30s, the 50s, the 60s and 70s is really important, because we've been fighting this thing for a long time. And I think that a lot of those thinkers and writers are foundational to like a lot of what's being rehashed today.
I can offer one comment, one thought from my interviewing, which is, and it's something that I had to learn how to do, and I don't know how to explain it right now, but I had to learn how to listen in a really deep way. which I think is something that we need to learn how to do. I don't think that we know how to listen most of the time. Mm-hmm. And I think that, we're attuned to like looking for things in a particular kind of way, but really listening in a deep way to people who might otherwise be written off because they're not, from Harvard, or because they might be described as mentally ill, or because they have a criminal record, or because they're communists or whatever, listening to them in a deep way. And so because I'm an anthropologist, I had some flexibility in the book. So there's one moment in particular where I try to show this happening, mm-hmm. which is when I found a letter that an incarcerated revolutionary wrote to his son while he was imprisoned. And I found the letter, which the person who wrote it hadn't seen in 50 years, and brought the person and the son together, and we read the letter together. And I thought, initially, I didn't understand the extent to which the letter had something to say about the long Attica revolt. I thought it was really just this letter, this beautiful love letter from this man to his son, which talks a lot about music. And there was a point in the interview, which I try to reveal to the readers, where the son tells the father, "Can you please read this part again?" And when the father read the part again, I listened to it in a different way and tried to work it into my analysis. So it's not the type of thing where I can say, this is how you do it, but just really listening, really becoming intimate with your sources. Like you were just talking about, having conversations with ancestors. You know what I mean? That's real. So figuring out, to the extent that you want to, how to really learn how to listen.
It's been a magnificent conversation, and I have a million questions spinning in my mind that I will follow up on. But I was hoping that you might be able to speak to one thing that I think, Charisse, you gestured toward, but then said that, kind of leave to later. And it's your invocation of racial capitalism as a concept that you move beyond. And I think Cedric Robinson is obviously somebody who's haunting the conversation quite a bit. Mm-hmm. In the references of the Black radical tradition and how to study it, a series of innovative methodological questions about how to study it, how to recognize it when we see it. And then this concept of racial capitalism that he uses, that you've dispensed with for capitalist racism. And I actually just was hoping we could stop for a minute and say a little bit about your relationship, both of your relationships to him as a thinker, and why that concept of racial capitalism is not doing the work that you think it needs to do. Charisse, that's specifically for you, Ori. I'm sure you have thoughts on that as well. And then this question about, particularly for you, Ori, about the Black radical tradition, just the idea of it, and whether his conception of it is one that we need to revise in an important way, and that your scholarship teaches us how to develop for a new generation of thinkers. So I'll put that on the table.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have no smoke with racial capitalism. In fact, I was asked recently by a very prominent scholar to hash out to participate in this debate about racial capitalism, and I was like, no. If you don't, I'm over it at this point. It's been going on for years, and it's usually white men who have a problem with racial capitalism. Okay, well, don't use it. That's my contribution to that debate. If it's useful, then use it. If it's not, then don't. I think that the way that Cedric Robinson stages racial capitalism, whereby it's a continuation from the feudal order, right? Racialism continues out from the feudal order. I don't understand, especially anti-Black racial oppression in that way. I understand it in the modern capitalist system as such. And so that's why I use capitalist racism. It's really that simple. And instead of having to go through this long critique of Cedric Robinson, which I don't find to be particularly illuminating, I have great respect, especially his book, Terms of Order. I really have great respect and admiration for Cedric Robinson. I think that trying to rewrite what racial capitalism means was less important to me than building off of racial capitalism to use capitalist racism to be talking about like capitalism as such, because I think that there are regimes of racism that emanate from capitalism as such. Even thinking with somebody like Oliver Cox. And so that's why I don't use racial capitalism, because then I also think that sometimes that can sort of not, that becomes a focus on, is this racial capitalism or not? And it's the same reason I use tradition of radical blackness instead of black radical tradition, because I'm talking about a tradition of political economy and like material analysis, whereas Robinson is talking more about political philosophy, metaphysics, and other things. And so I think it's a way to engage with those ideas without having to go through that work that's expected, especially of academics, to kind of like rip something apart. That's fine. It's just not what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I have an interesting relationship to Robinson's work, which I've read often and appreciate quite a bit, and it's helped me. But I was raised in a movement family, so I have so when I went to grad school, that was right when sort of Black Marxism was really starting to blow up in terms of how it was getting taken up in the academy. And when I read it, I was like, it was the first time that I had read like an academic book that was being taken, maybe not the first time, but it was an important time that I read an academic book that was being taken seriously by others, where I was like, oh, like I know this. Like I kind of already knew a lot of it. And it was a way, it really helped me see the extent to, it helped me understand where I could go with what I was interested in doing. And a couple of things that were really helpful. One was his constant, the way that he constantly enjoins us to understand that Black radicalism cannot be fully subsumed under Western radicalism, one. Two, that all of his works there's a demand for innovative methodological interventions, right? And so the story I just told you about the letter and how I was interpreting it, like that I felt like Robinson helped to give me permission to do something like that, right? Because he's always enjoining us to look beyond, to think differently methodologically. So that was really helpful. And then it was kind of shocking to me that there was no text that really, it's not true, like Dylan Rodriguez's work and others, but there's very few texts that really seriously engage with, by non-veterans of the movement, right? So there's a whole other body of scholarship that I draw on, people like Dhoruba bin Wahad, Jalil Muntakim, people who actually lived the struggle. So there's that. But I'm not in that category. That's a whole different category and has a whole different sort of basis of sort of legitimacy. But in terms of academic scholarship, there was just very little that seriously engaged with the Black radical tradition in prisons, in and through and against prisons. And so, and again, like I told you, I was asked to do this work by someone who was in the struggle, and that's where the accountability came from. And so Robinson became really a way for me to become legible to other academics. Like I can cite Robinson and they're like, okay, I understand, it's the Black radical tradition. Whereas for me, it's really a tradition that, he helped name and bring to a broader academic audience, but that's not where my sort of genealogy comes through.
All right. That was amazing.